In late 2006, Teen Titans aired its 5th and final season. Just like last season, in this video, I'll review each episode, give them a score, and then talk about the season in general at the end. Also, spoilers for the entire season. Without any further ado, every episode of Teen Titans Season 5 reviewed. Episode 1, Homecoming, Part 1. The Titans receive a distress call from Beast Boy's former team, the Doom Patrol. The show had a lot of momentum leaving Season 4. Unfortunately, this intro sequence is so incredibly boring and nonsensical that it's hard to be invested at all. To start with the only positive in this incredibly lengthy cold open, the music is fantastic and the action syncs up to it pretty well. Speaking of the action, it's terrible. None of the characters besides Beast Boy really have interesting powers, at least to watch. Mento can read minds and move stuff, Robot Man is strong, Elastigirl can grow, and Negative Man can leave his body and fight stuff in a quick and uncreatively shown way. This makes the action simplistic and uneventful, and the dialogue can't save it at all. None of the characters have any sense of personality, and Mento gets upset at Beast Boy for saving the day or something. Somehow they decided to stretch the idea of a character valuing the mission over friends for 2 episodes. But enough about the first 4 minutes. Once we get to our Titans in the modern day, the episode definitely starts to pick up. The tuba bit was pretty amusing and had great animation, a nice chill way to get reacquainted with our characters after last time we saw them they defeated a universe-conquering demon. Of course, that doesn't last very long as Beast Boy becomes serious Beast Boy, similar to the exact same thing they did back in Season 2. Finding Robot Man destroyed and tied up was neat, but the amount of jokes in between scenes of despair are severely misplaced. I'm glad that Robin doesn't try to fight with Beast Boy in this episode. Having the Titans be on his side the entire time was a nice change of pace, considering that the Titans fighting one another is a frequent plot device of these arcs. Robot Man wanting to destroy everything was really shaping up to be an interesting angle for this episode to take, but they forget about it relatively quickly. Although, the fights with just him without the rest of the Doom Patrol are easily the best of the episode, as the camera and well-choreographed jumps and punches makes it look fantastic. Anyway, we do eventually get back to Mento and the rest of the Doom Patrol, where we have a pretty decent fight, although we do get some more characterization of the Doom Patrol that's relatively minor, and I have the same simplicity issues with the fight. Of course, they had to go with the mission over friends mentality to end the episode. This episode is a significant step down from last season. The fights aren't good, the jokes are either boring or misplaced, and the Doom Patrol have no personality besides Mento being all about mission over life. While this rating may seem low, this episode is one of the most important of the season, if not the series, and besides some slightly above average but incredibly short fights in the middle, they completely fumbled it. Episode 2, Homecoming Part 2. Beast Boy joins the Doom Patrol in trying to stop the Brain's quantum generator. The beginning of this episode is fine. It's one of the longer cold opens of the series at about 2 minutes, but the quick overview of each member of the Brotherhood of Evil allows for them to skip introductions and fight scenes later in the episode. Anyway, Beast Boy pretty much chooses the Doom Patrol over the Titans, and they leave the Titans alone until the very end. The first fight of the episode is against the all-formidable enemy of quicksand. This entire scene is pointless. I can't imagine what the possible purpose of this interaction is. The plot isn't moved forward, there's no thematic purpose either, and the only characterization I can take from it is that the Doom Patrol, and especially Robot Man, is incompetent. Somehow, the next scene isn't much better. To quickly summarize the fight, the robot defeats each member easily until Beast Boy hits him once, he comes back to life, and Robot Man sacrifices himself. Yep, that's pretty much the entirety of this fight, as they decide once again to remind you that the Doom Patrol values missions over their friends. After this scene, they kind of attempt to do a bit of characterization by having Elastigirl tell Beast Boy that trying to forget about it helps, although this barely matters as 1, the audience obviously knows that Robot Man isn't dead, and 2, the Doom Patrol, especially Elastigirl and Negative Man, stay nearly characterless the entire time. Anyway, the scene in the desert isn't much of a fight scene as it is an excuse to get rid of Negative Man and Elastigirl. While Beast Boy and Mento's conversation was a great opportunity to just have them talk, Mento instead just immediately concedes to do what Beast Boy says. The part after this is actually pretty decent though, not in characterization or dialogue of course, that's bad for the entire episode, but the action for the rest of the episode is pretty solid. The break-in scene has no right looking as cool as it does, and the fight against Monsieur Mala and Madame Rouge is well choreographed and is relatively short and sweet. I know I'm going through these fights quickly, and that's just because these fights are so simple. The music is fine, but the fights are super short and basic. The very very last fight with everyone coming back is expected but underwhelming, and most of the fighting is done off screen while Beast Boy just forgets about the theme. The entire point of these two episodes is that friends are worth more than the mission, and that's what started the first episode and has been the main point of this one. So why then would Beast Boy redirect the black hole towards them in order to complete the mission and risk his friends? It's a complete 180 from the attempted theme. Anyway, the Brain and his crew flee, and the Doom Patrol leave after a nice and short scene, and while that's all good and stuff, I really feel like they set up these characters for something and really tease their return. But somehow, this is the last we see of the Doom Patrol. Seriously, they're never seen or mentioned again as the Titans take over this season. This episode, just like the last one, is a complete mess. Instead of using the developed Titans, they focus on personality void one-time characters to start the final arc of the series. This season opener is a huge disappointment from the fantastic ending of season 4, and the only positive thing it does have is one or two kind of cool fights and an ending with all the villains to set up the season. Episode 3, Trust. Madame Rouge tries to gain Hotspot's trust in order to snag his Titans communicator. Coming right after the disaster of the season opener, this one should be terrible, but surprisingly, it's actually pretty good. The opening is great. Wildebeest running from Rouge with a beautiful background is fantastic, and they keep it short and sweet. The scene after the intro is the first time that Mala and the Brain are seen playing chess in Paris. They do this a few times, and it's fantastic. Both of these characters are well written during these scenes, the music is fantastic, and the voice actors do a great job. The way that they use chess moves to represent what they are planning is incredibly cool, and the entire scene just has an air of creepiness to it that's well appreciated in this action-heavy scene. Speaking of which, the chase scene with Hotspot and the criminal doesn't really have much going for it besides some nice music to fit the setting. Of course, the main fight that pretty much makes up the rest of the episode is Madame Rouge versus Hotspot. The first time they fight is pretty short and consists of Rouge not being able to hit Hotspot and Hotspot running away. They don't really conceal the fact that Robin isn't actually there, as they frequently show him somewhere else and have Rouge just beg for the communicator and ask him to turn off his powers. This is appreciated, as they also don't have Hotspot ever get mad at the real Robin for what Rouge does for any extended period of time, which is a trope I was sure they were going to try to do. After a quick scene with Robin and Star that doesn't do much, we get Hotspot and Rouge's second fight, which lasts for a pretty long time and is thankfully much better. Once Rouge realizes that she can throw stuff back at him, it gets much more interesting. Of course, the real Robin arrives and fights Rouge, which for some reason stays as Robin. I guess that after everyone fought themselves in the end, they wanted Robin to get to also. This fight is actually pretty cool, although Hotspot's final interaction with Rouge is still easily the best. Hotspot takes an entire building down on top of her and she still catches him. Robin then gives her a communicator and the episode just ends. There's a lot I want to say about this episode that applies to a lot of the season, so I'll save most of that for the season overview. This is the first episode to not focus on the Titans, and it doesn't disappoint. While some scenes like Rouge and Hotspot drag on and get a bit boring, this episode is clever, suspenseful, and has average to great fight scenes and fantastic music. Episode 4, For Real. Control Freak attempts to get revenge on the Titans. Unfortunately, the Titans are out of town and left Titans East in charge. The last episode revolving around Control Freak was one of the best episodes in the series, and while this one isn't nearly as good as the season 4 opener, it's still fairly enjoyable. The cold open is a fairly decent idea, but it goes on for 2 minutes and feels like 30. Getting past the intro, getting an entire episode around Titans East is a fairly interesting concept. While I disliked the arc that they were part of, I do like the Titans East as characters, as they have some level of chemistry with one another. The scene with Titans East just completely destroying Control Freak the first time had the potential to be really boring, but they made it just quick and interesting enough to be enjoyable. After this fight, Control Freak bails, and we get 10 minutes of the Titans East just walking around and helping people. I get that this was necessary in order to show the difference in public opinion once they saved the day, but the fight against the bank robber felt completely pointless, and the other scenes were drawn out. Thankfully, Control Freak comes back at the end to give Titans East a challenge that's tailored to them. This part of the episode is easily the best, although taking away Speedy's only power made his section completely unrelated to him, unless you buy the whole using himself as an arrow thing. The way they solve each problem is relatively creative in most cases, with Speedy's definitely being the most fun to watch. Unfortunately, they cut way too frequently, and these scenarios barely get to play out before it switches to a different one. The ending too is a bit anticlimactic. Control Freak just gives himself up. I get that they already did a lightsaber duel with him, but some kind of final challenge felt appropriate. Finally, finally, they wrap things up with Cyborg, and the episode concludes on a bit of a whimper. This episode is pretty much average. About half is below average, half is above. It's relatively funny, and the action that's nothing special gets the job done. While disappointing for a Control Freak episode, it's certainly not terrible or even bad. Episode 5, Snowblind. The Titans get a distress call from Russia. They encounter Red Star, a superpowered outcast and a creature that thrives on radiation. The opening scene is one of the most ambiguous in the series. It leaves the rest of the episode to have some suspense, which is perfect for this type of perfect soldier gone wrong episode. After some village small talk to purely set up the fact that Tamaranians are immune to the cold, we get the first fight. Well, I guess it's not really a fight as they can't hit the monster, but Raven turning the entire place into darkness made for a beautiful scene, and Star leaves to find Red Star. I found this to honestly be one of the best setups for a Starfire episode. Generally her setups are weird or out of character, but this one makes sense. Anyway, the scene where Star wakes up in Red Star's house is well done. The camera slowly building up to the reveal that he's the one locked up and not Starfire is a great use of camera in this show. Star going along with what Red Star says and being friendly before completely turning on him is uncharacteristic for Star, as she pretty much calls him a coward before going back to being friendly once the invader turns out to be the rest of her team. His backstory is done pretty well. I liked the black and white old-timey film aesthetic, and the Professor Chang cameo was cool too. Red Star has one of the darkest backstories in this show that's actually explained. The fight with the monster in his house is definitely the best of the episode, as the sequence where Red Star completely destroys him after each of the Titans can't even touch him is great. They kind of ignore the fact that Starfire can actually touch him due to her immunity, but that just allows for Red Star to take over fights. Quickly, before getting to the end, Beast Boy and Cyborg to an extent are just here for comedy, and they do a pretty good job of lightening the mood in this dark episode. Back to the ending, the reveal of the General was out of nowhere and was fantastic. The shame that the General feels once Starfire points out that it was his fault too is portrayed very well. The last fight is just a quick repeat of the one before, but the last scene is much more interesting. The scene is just completely 100% set up for you to believe that he dies. Then, later in the season, he just magically comes back with no explanation. If he died, I would consider this an excellent ending, but after watching the entire season, it's just a waste of emotional development. Snowblind is an example of how a few things can hold a great episode back. Had they had one more solid fight and actually killed him, this could have been one of the best in the season. Instead, its interesting backstory and semi-funny jokes keep it relatively average. Episode 6, Cole. While pursuing Dr. Light, the Titans stumble across a prehistoric jungle in the middle of the Arctic. They make friends with a young girl named Cole and her friend Gnark. This season, they set themselves up for a worldwide adventure where anything is possible and they can use so many of DC's characters. In this episode, where they do have a unique setting and character, they fumble it completely. The cold open is a cliche, hero shows up at the right moment. Robin's one-liners to start fights are generally somewhat clever, but this one is just pathetic. The first fight lasts for about 2 minutes and is just a bore, so I'll skip past that and get into the scene where 3 of our characters forget that they can fly. I wish they had some reason to explain why they didn't just fly, but they even show Beast Boy turning into a creature, so I guess the plot convenience is the only reason they had. The next scene is somehow the highlight of the episode. I found the joke where Beast Boy comes back to announce their doom to be one of the funniest lines in the series.
What did they say?
Well, they want to eat us.
Of course, no scene can stay good for long in this episode, as our 5 superheroes fail to defeat small dinosaurs. Of course, Gnark and Cole come in, 2 of the least interesting characters in the show. Their relationship is the main focus of the episode, where they can't decide whether they want it to be maternal, romantic, or brotherly, so it just stays incredibly uncomfortable the entire time. In between this moment and the last fight, there are so many useless scenes. Just to list a few, Cyborg gets bullied for what seems like accidental sexism, Cyborg mispronounces Gnark, the light bulb scene, their eating competition, which I still fail to see the significance in, besides I guess being a reason that Cole might like the Titans more. Cole gets kidnapped in an incredibly lame scene. Gark's inability to say other words makes the kidnapping reveal be more of a joke than a serious scene. There's a tar pit scene, which makes the quicksand from the last episode seem like an action shot. The last fight is so slow with so many breaks, and the ending takes years to explain before it happens. Dr. Light is incredible great here either, but he's really not important. Only 3 scenes actually matter, and the rest is unfunny filler. A terribly boring episode that has unfunny jokes, bad fights, and boring scenes. Episode 7, Hide and Seek. Raven is forced to babysit 3 superpowered infants while she takes them to a safe place from the Brotherhood of Evil. Unfortunately, Monsieur Mala is in pursuit. Despite some of the other episodes in the season so far being heavily based on other characters, this is technically the first episode in the series to not feature all 5 main Titans, with no appearance from Star or Cyborg. And with Robin being silent and Beast Boy being there only through calls, this episode is just about as focused on Raven as you can get. Speaking about Beast Boy, he's actually pretty funny in this episode. His constant uncaring attitude is pretty comedic against Raven's general disposition. Speaking of Raven, because the kids are just crying situation makers, she is given all of the attention in this episode. From the beginning, this episode does utilize kids crying and screaming, and while this is generally too unpleasant to be worth it, they use it relatively sparingly and instead take most of the comedy from Raven being such a terrible babysitter. The scene on the train is the first example of this, as she tells him to shut up and closes her eyes. While this has the potential to be a terrible gag, the show writes it pretty well. Mala's introduction with Timmy telling Raven that he sees a monkey man is also pretty clever. The first fight is short besides Bobby's first appearance, but I'll talk about him a little bit later. Skipping forward a little bit, the general breakdown in the cabin is hilarious, as Raven is just completely helpless with these kids. The bedtime story is also a great joke, as it kind of unintentionally shows how light this season is at times in comparison to last season. What follows is the best fight of the episode, the fight atop the cable car. The whole fight is fantastic besides the constant motion blur. The fight would be fine without all the motion blur, so why they added it is beyond me. Anyway, the car sliding down the mountain was fine, but I want to talk about the whole Bobby thing. Before I go and complain about the ending of this episode of a kids show from 2005, in case you didn't know, unlike many of the other characters in the show with presets, backstories, and abilities from the comics, Bobby and Melvin are original to the show. So it is completely the episode's fault that Bobby is not just an imaginary friend used by Melvin to justify her powers. While I get that he is the incarnation of her imagination or whatever, they could have tied Raven's struggles with her powers to her teaching Melvin how to control hers, with Melvin using what Raven taught her to defeat Mala at the end. Instead, they go for the twist ending of Bobby coming to defeat Mala, and while this fight does look cool, it's completely void of substance. This episode had a lot of potential to be thematically great, but they really only capitalize on it comedically. It's a really funny episode though, and continues the trend of Raven and Robin's episodes being the best of the series. Episode 8, Lightspeed. To impress the Brotherhood of Evil, the Hive 5 attempt to deal with their new opponent, Kid Flash. This episode is the only one in the series to have zero involvement from any of the main Titans. While this is a very interesting idea, it could easily turn into a disaster if the characters focused on are boring. Luckily, this episode focuses on the leader of the Hive 5, Jinx, and Kid Flash. From the beginning, the Hive 5 make for great main characters for the episode. The museum scene lets each of the other characters have their joke or two while still keeping most of the focus on Jinx. Besides our main Titans, the Hive 5 easily have the best synergy in the show, along with perhaps the Titans East, but just watching them chill in their base is enjoyable. The crimes being stopped by Kid Flash in the middle of the episode are great. Each scene is animated beautifully. The hockey scene especially is clever for how short it is. Speaking of the animation, the facial expression of the characters in this episode, and especially Kid Flash, are fantastic. The entire episode is helped out tremendously by its impeccable animation. For example, the scene in the museum is very simple dialogue-wise. However, through Jinx's faces, you can see her ponder whether or not she should go with Kid Flash or betray him. The maze segment of this relatively average fight is cool, even if it is kind of awkward. Once they capture Kid Flash, the way he just nonchalantly leaves and comes back is pretty comical. The sudden shift in tone when Jinx calls Madame Rouge is done very well. With the fights up until this point being mostly mediocre, Kid Flash messing with the High Five in their base going from room to room is hilarious. All leading up to Madame Rouge coming and scorning Jinx for losing him. This might be Rouge's best episode as she completely crushes Jinx's dreams over and over and over again. Her fight with Kid Flash is a bit confusing as Kid Flash gets significantly nerfed if the fight is at all close. With the help of Seymour, Jinx eventually captures Kid Flash, and while Rouge ends up being the one to convince Jinx of becoming good instead of Flash, The ending scene with Jinx discovering the rose and walking into the unknown is a fantastic end to the episode. Unlike most of the other villains in this show, Jinx's powers directly lead her to evil. However, this episode shows how despite her powers being bad luck, just like Raven, she can fight the evil inside of her and, well, fight the evil outside of her. Kid Flash is funny and charismatic, the other members of the High Five are great side characters, Madame Rouge is at her best, and Jinx becomes a great protagonist after really being a regular villain before this. Great episode that really stands out in the season and in the series. Episode 9, Revved Up. A thief manages to steal Robin's personal briefcase. Despite perhaps having some serious moments, this is the last comedy-based episode in the series, also being the last with the Japanese intro. And they go out with a pretty great episode. Starting things off, the Titans get split into 3 groups, and therefore 3 subplots. Starting off with Raven and Star, the return of the duo from Switch is appreciated, and their plot is filled with great scenes and funny jokes consistently. While nothing is incredible or anything, it definitely uses the limited amount of time given to it incredibly well. Speaking of subplots, the Beast Boy and Cyborg plot is okay. It's definitely not as consistently funny as Star and Raven, but Beast Boy talking to Robin in trucker talk and Cyborg finally letting Beast Boy take the wheel are both great moments. The entire pit stop car chasing after them is a bit repetitive though, and the creatures on it are incredibly boring. But the main point of the episode is Robin and Red X. This is clearly the best part of the entire episode, but unfortunately it is given less than a third of the runtime. While seeing Star and Raven take over a school bus with a rocket on top filled with unremarkable villains, and seeing Beast Boy and Cyborg get the T-car slowly more and more disassembled is fun, the Robin scenes are spectacular. First, just seeing both of them on their motorcycles fighting on the mountain is fantastic. The choreography is incredible, and it's different than every other fight the show has ever had. While another serious Red X episode would have been neat, I'm not really sure what else they could have done without revealing who it was. The scene where Robin saves X is fantastic. Robin doesn't even look at him and just continues to chase after Ding Dong Daddy. Speaking of Ding Dong Daddy, there really isn't much to say. He's not much of a character, and he's barely in the episode, so it barely matters. The reveal of all the villains in one place was kind of already done with the Brotherhood of Evil, but still seeing them all is pretty cool. Red X going from villain to villain, destroying each one's vehicle in a different way was fantastic, and the ending with Star and Raven is such a great end to both of their arcs. One problem with this scene, which also comes up later, is that the vast majority of villains are silent due to them not having their voice actors. This is kind of ridiculous. I get that having all of these voice actors back would be expensive, but they should have either used old clips, paid for the actors, or played some loud music to cover it up or something. Still, the ending with all the Titans crossing the finish line in different conditions is really humorous, and the callback to Masks with Robin talking about keeping secrets is also great. While not revealing what was in the suitcase is a bit frustrating, it's not really a big deal. This episode is a pretty good last comedic episode with the return of Red X and some great jokes and fights, but the Beast Boy and Cyborg plot is a bit underwhelming and very repetitive. Episode 10. Go. The origin of the Titans. With only having 4 episodes left in the series, we finally get the origin story of the Titans. The concept of having 4 of them team up to stop Star is pretty interesting, and they pull it off pretty well. Star's introduction is perfectly intense, and sets up the relatively dark tone for the first half of the episode. Robin's introduction is somehow even better, as we find out this takes place right after leaving Batman. Anyway, the first fight against Star is fairly long, but they fill it with a lot of great scenes. Throughout the entire fight, more and more Titans join in, the first of which being Beast Boy. His introduction shows how connected to the Doom Patrol he still is, and ties this episode at least a bit to the season arc. Cyborg and Raven soon follow as the fight continues, eventually leading to Starfire kissing and shoving Robin in a pretty funny scene. Cyborg freaking out about being half machine and expecting Beast Boy to be horrified is honestly the saddest scene in the episode, as Cyborg is still dealing with the aftermath of his accident. The Titans disperse temporarily before coming back to stop the alien. I'm glad they didn't have them separate for too long, as it was a bit uncharacteristic for them just to all bail. Starfire eventually goes back to her kind self from the series kind of out of nowhere, as her attitude does a complete 180. From this point on, they really nail the relationships between characters. Cyborg's scene with Raven is really telling of her role with the team, and is written very well. The final fight scene against the Horde is fine, although it ends kind of abruptly and anticlimactically, with Raven using a spell and Cyborg shooting him off screen. While it does kind of end before they officially become a team, team, the ending is nice and not only gives some context to the show, but is also the last step in Robin and Star's relationship before the movie, even if it does chronologically come first. A great episode that shows both the origins of the Titans and is an action-packed funny episode on its own. Episode 11, Calling All Titans. By using the Titans communicator, the Brotherhood of Evil tracks down all of the Titans around the world. There is a lot stuffed into these 22 minutes, so I'll go ahead and get to the episode. The first 9 minutes are about each of the 5 main Titans going to recruit 5 final members to the larger Titans cause. I'm going to be honest, this really isn't that exciting. While I would go over each of these, none of these interactions are all that interesting. The only thing I will say is that the dimension where Harold is found is fantastically animated and looks great. Anyway, once you get past kind of the boring conversations, you get the payoff of the last 8 episodes as the Brain finally releases his attack. While another extended chess scene would have been cool, the Brain and Mala are really not a huge part of this episode. What does play a large part of this episode is the all-out attack from most of the villains in the show. While the lack of voices from a large portion of the villains is a bit distracting for the episode, I found it to not be nearly as noticeable as it was in Revved Up. While each scene is a bit too short for me to go over extensively, the way the episode manages to display such chaos and hopelessness, largely from Robin's perspective, is fantastic. Of course, they don't actually show many of the Titans getting defeated, something that is very intentional, but still some Titans like Speedy and Aqualad get completely demolished. Just the pure variety of villains makes the scene enjoyable, and the way they combine characters is great too. Of course, this leads to the longest and most important fight of the episode, despite only being 2 minutes, Robin versus Rouge. This likely would have been more interesting had it not already happened, but unlike the first fight where Robin used everything but gadgets, here he only uses gadgets. The fight ends with Robin getting defeated and turning off all of the communicators, leaving a defeated Beast Boy alone and clueless. The first half of this episode is pretty bad, while the second half is really good. All part 1s in the series ends with something terrible happening, and while this technically isn't a part 1, it might as well be. While I do really like what the latter half of this episode goes for, the first half holds it back. Episode 12, Titans Together. Beast Boy leads the few remaining honorary members in a desperate attempt to free the captives and stop the Brain once and for all. While definitely not the best monologue to come from the Brain this season, the one to start off this episode was a pretty good recap of the last episode. While seeing all of the Titans get seemingly defeated was cool and all, the reveal at the end of the cold open that the Brain was talking to Robin is a fantastic way, in addition to revealing Beast Boy's success, to start the episode. While everyone being able to find the secret base with no instruction is a bit weird, the temporary group of the 5 remaining Titans is actually really good, especially Moss, who continuously has some of the best gags in the entire episode. Despite being the end of an arc, which is generally really serious, this episode is actually fairly funny. Whether or not that's a good thing is debatable, but I'll talk about the less serious vibe of the season at the end. Anyway, power-wise, they picked fantastic characters to go with Beast Boy. Pantha has some great wrestling moves, Harold's portals allow for some sick shots, Jericho, who should have had his own episode with Slade by the way, also allows us to see some of the villains fight each other, and Moss, as mentioned before, is mostly used for comedy and fights. Seeing them take over Cinderblock was really well choreographed, there's not really much else to say about it. Seeing Robin's freezing being a big deal is really interesting, as pretty much every villain here would have a bone to pick with Robin. The fight against the group in the hallway is pretty much useless, so I'll go ahead and get into what could be described as a 10-minute long fight scene. The first half is what I would call useless. It's well choreographed and uses abilities in a cool ways and all that, but they lose pretty quickly and then get saved by the Titans coming back in a cool, albeit cliche way. While most of the Titans not actually being defeated does degrade the beginning a bit, the final fight scene is fantastic. The fight scene is filled with so many great moments that it's impossible for me to talk about them all and still have this video be relatively short. But to go through some of my favorites, Robin and Cyborg pull off their combo from the first episode, Jinx takes out both the High Five and Madame Rouge, and the return of so many characters that we haven't seen in so long. Some since the first season were all incredible. The music too, with the anime-like repurposing of the theme to the use of the Titans East theme with Masimanos, was great. While the bomb thing was a bit lackluster, seeing Beast Boy as a gorilla fight Mala was a nice way to end the fight, especially considering the Brain can't fight himself. The ending is a nice send-off, although they do miss the classic 5-person party like at the end of season 4. I'll talk about it more at the end of the video, but despite lacking any emotional stakes, this ending has enough great action and allows Beast Boy to show how his leadership has grown since he was part of the Doom Patrol. Episode 13, The things change. Tara is back but doesn't seem to remember anything. Beast Boy becomes obsessed with helping her. This episode is easily the most controversial of the series. Whether or not someone likes it is based on what parts of the show they like the most. If it's the action and comedy, it's a terrible finale. If it's the interesting characters and occasionally complex themes, it's fantastic. Luckily for me, I'm in the latter category, and although I do appreciate the action sometimes, the characters is what really draws me into the show. Anyway, enough dodging the episode. The beginning is great for setting the mood and theme immediately. The episode is a bummer throughout, which is expected in an episode all about the fallout to the most tragic arc in the series. The monster is perfect in this episode. It fairly obviously represents change and is fittingly never defeated, only delayed. His fights are generally more thematic than action-packed, and they are easily the smallest action portion of any episode, so I'll be largely focusing on the Tara stuff. Speaking of which, while I know that some theories have her as someone else or the events of this episode being in Beast Boy's mind, the questionably canonic comics have the confirmation of this actually being Tara, and her comments towards the end definitely make it seem like it's not only her, but that she does remember at least a little bit. Anyway, I keep getting sidetracked, so back to the actual episode. I love the angle of the 4 Titans against Beast Boy. It really conveys how alone he feels. The actual schoolyard scene is mostly there just for setting up, so I'll just skip to their first conversation, the pizza scene. While these encounters get progressively better, this one is still great. The imagery with the spilt water is fantastic, as Tara truly is just a reflection of her former self. Tara seeing the mirror that Beast Boy made her also reiterates this point, as she becomes increasingly irritated with Beast Boy. Seeing her in the room again is fantastic, and while Beast Boy throwing mud at her was a bit weird for the episode, it does a great job in showing how Beast Boy is dealing with this. He's confused and hopeless and is willing to try anything. 2 of the next 3 scenes are among the best in the show. First, Slade's return. Although he's a robot, it's fair to say that he programmed and controlled it. It's spectacular. The mirror scene mirrors betrayal as Beast Boy finds an outlet for his anger. But it's not just Slade's excellent dialogue and incredible imagery that makes this fantastic. It's the way that they show Beast Boy's anger. The fight is incredibly short, but had this actually been the real Slade, which Beast Boy thought it was, he definitely would have killed him. You can hear Beast Boy impale Robot Slade and then crush him under a rock. While I would have loved Slade's last moments to be a Robin moment, especially with Jericho, this really does give Slade a great send-off, even if it is a bit short. Quickly in the middle, we get one last fight with the Change Monster. Again, it's mostly to fill space, although for doing that, it does have thematic importance. Once they get out of the library, we get Beast Boy and Tara's last scene, and also the last scene of the show. While each line of this conversation is worth talking about, the 2 heavy hitters are obviously Tara's near admittance that she knows a little.
Well, happy then. Things were never the way you remember.
And the titular line.
Things changed, Beast Boy. The girl you want me to be is just a memory.
Both of these are completely tragic. Beast Boy remembers Tara as a happy hero with sad moments, but Tara remembers herself as a sad villain with happy moments. Tara has moved on one way or another, and Beast Boy just has to accept that. The last word of the series being over as Beast Boy runs into the unknown, having accepted that she has changed, is great. This is definitely the longest I've talked about any episode, and it's well deserved. It's the weirdest episode in the series, and it's definitely not for everyone, but for me, it's a well-written, depressing, beautifully thematic episode that encapsulates the theme of change perfectly through multiple methods. Now for the season overview. Generally when I do these, I talk about the episodes in 2 segments, ones that are story-based and one-offs. The problem this time is that the vast majority are story-based, and even the 1 or 2 that you could say are separated from the story, such as Revved Up and Go, either reference the story or are the result of the Titans traveling around. So because of that, I'm just going to go over the story in general for this season and mention episodes in context. So to begin, we have the awful season opener. While it's awful on its own, it's arguably even worse when you realize that the themes and Doom Patrol from this episode never make a return. Beast Boy's arc ends up being about leadership, yet here it's barely mentioned. The next kind of section is trust through hide and seek, since all of these episodes are about introducing honorary titans, besides For Real, which is all about what's happening in Jump City. All of these episodes are average besides Trust, which is pretty good, and Cool, which is pretty bad. These episodes do give each Titan besides Beast Boy an episode, so that's cool I guess, although Robins and Cyborgs barely feel like character-centric episodes. Then we have the kind of formula-breaking episodes like Lightspeed, which finally gives Jinx the spotlight, Revved Up, which would be a lot cooler if the entire season arc wasn't based on bringing back a bunch of characters, and Go, which gives a backstory to the Titans, which I think comes at the exact right right time in the series. The finale to the arc is a pretty good culmination of the brain's plan, and I already talked about the actual series finale for 750 words, so I'll leave that one alone until the series overview. In general, while the less serious tone was a bit of a letdown, and having another Beast Boy focused season after 2 felt strange, the longer season arc did do a great job of mixing things up. There are still 5 episodes that at least partially take place in Jump City, but a lot of those don't involve the actual Titans. The Brain, Monsieur Mala, Madame Rouge, and the General are all fairly interesting, definitely more interesting than Trigon and Brother Blood, while still being significantly worse than Slade, who should have returned in at least a Jericho episode, which I will never not be salty for. Anyway, this is definitely not the most emotionally great season arc as the other ones in the series have been. Still, it's not as bad as other people say, so I'm giving it a 7, just like 1 through 3. Stick around for the series overview where I'll rank the seasons, do top 7 and bottom 7 episodes, and give the series in general a score. Speaking of which, I will be reviewing the movie, Trouble in Tokyo, in between this vid and that series overview, but hopefully I'll be able to finish that relatively quickly. Anyway, my least favorite episode was Cole, and my favorite was Things Change. This has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you for Trouble in Tokyo. Thanks for watching. Over.